Welcome to Part 5 of Divided by Time. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 25. Bassett could tell something was off just by looking at Dick's feverish eyes. Uneasily, he decided to stick with him, even though Dick only spoke once during their walk. "My head hurts like crazy," Dick murmured, his voice flat and lifeless. Despite Dick's clear desire to be alone, Bassett stayed close. The idea that Dick planned to turn himself in filled him with unease. Trailing Dick down the hall, Bassett resolved to keep a watchful eye on him for the next few hours. He was already thinking of ways to smuggle Dick out of town and take him back east, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Dick was falling seriously ill. The mind had a weird way of affecting the body. Dick collapsed onto the edge of the bed. "My head hurts like crazy," he repeated. "Can you check my bag for some tablets? I'm feeling dizzy." With a bit of effort, Dick stretched out on the bed. "Wow," he muttered. "I haven't had a headache this bad since—" His voice faded as he drifted off to sleep, breathing heavily. Bassett, rummaging through the army bag in the corner, paused to glance over. Dick was out cold. For a long time, Bassett sat beside the bed, watching Dick and trying to come up with a plan. The weight of responsibility and the looming threat of tragedy pressed down on him. He had no doubt now that Livingstone was indeed Clark, and that once he woke up, he'd insist on surrendering himself. Bassett's thoughts wandered back to the day he first visited the old house as a patient, tracing the strange path they'd both walked since then. He realized that each life was just one thread in a complex tapestry. To mess with one thread was to tangle them all. David Livingstone, the girl in the blue dress, the man twitching uneasily on the bed, the Sheriff Wilkins himself, and who knows how many others, all intertwined. He cursed under his breath. The maid knocked. He cracked the door open and sent her away. With his newfound resolve, even the maid was a risk. She was the same old woman who cleaned his room, and she might have known Clark. He had no idea what cosmic luck had spared him from being recognized so far, but it couldn't last forever. After about an hour, Bassett locked the door and headed down for lunch. He wasn't hungry. He just needed to get out of the room and clear his head. Pretending to eat, he mulled over the situation. Right in front of him was the biggest story of his career, but he couldn't go through with it. It was typical of him to see things through to the end before giving up. He didn't think that either Dick surrendering voluntarily or he himself revealing the truth would necessarily lead to a murder conviction. Convicting a man of a crime he didn't know he'd committed would be tough. Still, with his usual thoroughness, he explored that angle too. If Livingstone was acquitted, he'd be known as Clark again. The new identity he'd painstakingly created for himself would be destroyed. The story would haunt him forever. In his particular field, trust and respect were everything. All that would be wiped out. Slowly, his thoughts returned to David, and he wrestled with the motive behind such a decisive act. A man who took a path with nothing to gain and everything to lose was either a fool or driven by some deep unselfishness. To save a life. Given all the resources Clark could have marshaled, combined with his personal popularity, a first-degree sentence was unlikely. Not a life sentence, but perhaps something even more significant. A man's soul. Suddenly, in a moment of crystal-clear understanding, he realized what David had tried to do, take this wanderer, whose mind had been wiped clean by shock and illness, leaving only childish memories, and guide him to create a new identity. To take the body he found, and the untouched soul within, and mold them into a real man. And with that understanding came the belief that David had succeeded. He had indeed shaped a man. Clark ate absently while checking the train schedules and mapping out the arguments he'd use against Dick's insistence on turning himself in. He anticipated a tough battle ahead, but knew he had some strong points. The potential undoing of David's efforts, and involving David in legal trouble for aiding a fugitive. Plus, Dick's responsibility to the girl back home. He was more confident about the logistics. There was an express train passing through on the main line at midnight, and a local one on the branch line at 8. Yet, the local train and station posed too many potential risks. After pondering for a bit, he decided to hire a car, drive down to the main line with Dick, and send the car back. He went out immediately, arranged for the car, and upon returning, informed the clerk of his plan to leave, asking for his bill. After a moment's pause, he added, "I'll pay for room 322. My friend is coming with me. Yes, we'll be leaving tonight." As he turned away, he noticed the short, stocky figure of Wilkins entering. He stepped aside and observed. The sheriff went to the desk, flipped through several pages in the registry, then looked up and saw him. "Been away, haven't you?" Wilkins asked. "Yeah," Clark replied. "I went on a little horseback trip into the mountains. My knees still aren't talking to me." The sheriff laughed, but then got serious. "Have a seat," he said. "I'm going to keep an eye on who's coming and going for a bit." Bassett, hesitant, followed him to 2 chairs facing the desk and lobby. He had the key to Dick's room in his pocket, knowing that if Dick woke up, he could easily call and get his door unlocked. But that wasn't the only thing on his mind. He suddenly felt sure that the sheriff's watch was somehow connected to Dick. Wilkins, who had always seemed a friendly guy, now loomed ominously in his mind. As the minutes ticked by, with the sheriff focused intensely on the lobby and staircase, Bassett's anxiety turned to fear. His heart jumped every time a bell rang, and clerks hurried off with boys in tow. His hands shook, cold and clammy. Through it all, Wilkins kept up an inconsequential stream of chatter. "Expecting someone specific?" Bassett managed to ask after a few minutes. "Yes, I'll fill you in as soon as. Bill, is Alex outside?" Bill stopped in front of them and nodded. "Good, all right, listen up. I want everything calm and orderly. No drama. I'll come out behind him, and you and Bill stay nearby. Once we're outside, I'll talk to him. When we walk off, just keep close behind." Bill casually moved to a spot near the entrance as Wilkins turned back to Bassett, who had used the moment to gather himself and plan his own course of action. "Someone's having a rough day," Bassett remarked. "Speaking of rough, I've got a sick friend from back home. We need to catch the midnight train, too." "That's a shame," Wilkins said absently, then, as if realizing he should show more concern, added, "Tell you what I'll do. I've got some business to take care of, but it'll be wrapped up soon, one way or another. I'll bring my car around and take him to the station. These cabs are awful to ride in." The threat to his plans steadied the reporter, and he kept his face neutral. "Thanks," he said. "I'll let you know if he's up for traveling. Is this business of yours confidential?" "Well, yes and no. I've talked some to you, and since you're leaving anyway, it's the Judd Clark case again. Hysteria, probably. People will be seeing him all over the country for the next 6 months. Yeah, but I've never seen a hysterical Indian. A little while ago, an Indian woman named Lizzie Lazarus came into my office. She's smart. Her husband was a mixed breed, a dairy hand at the Clark Ranch for years. Lizzie was the first Indian woman around here to go to school, and besides being smart, she has that sharp Indian sight. You know how it is, when they're not blinded by trachoma, they can see better than a telescope." Bassett made an effort. "What's that got to do with Judd Clark?" he asked. "Well, she came in. You know there was a reward out for him, and I guess it still stands. I'll have to check, because if Maggie Donaldson wasn't crazy, someone will find him someday. Anyway, Lizzie said she saw Judd Clark. Saw him standing at a second-story window of this hotel. Can you believe that?" "Not for a second. She must be making it up." "That's what I thought at first, but I'm not so sure. It would be like him to come back and mock us if he thought he could get away with it. He didn't know fear. The only time he ever panicked was after the shooting, and then he was full of hooch and on the verge of DTs. "A man doesn't joke around with the hangman's noose," Bassett commented dryly. He checked his watch and stood up. "It's a good story, but I wouldn't waste any more time here waiting for him. If he's still alive, he's done a pretty good job of staying out of trouble for the past 10 years. Remember, even if he's around, he's probably changed his appearance so much that neither Telescope Lizzie nor you would recognize him." "Probably," the sheriff said nonchalantly. "Still, I'm not taking any chances. I'm up for re-election this fall, and that Darnaldson woman's story almost ruined me. I've got someone at the railroad station, just in case. Bassett headed upstairs and walked along the hallway, lost in gloomy thoughts. The trap he'd set was closing in, and his mind raced with plans to get Dick out before it was too late. Maybe it would be best to keep Livingstone hidden in his room until things cooled down. But then again, Livingstone wasn't likely to stay put quietly. The motor to the main line seemed like the best option. First, though, he had to convince Livingstone to go, which wouldn't be easy. And then there was the matter of getting him out of the hotel, now that the alarm had been raised. When he found Dick still asleep, he carefully inspected the second floor. There was another staircase, but it led into the kitchens. He finally settled on a fire escape from a rear hall window, leading into a courtyard cluttered with the untidy mess of an overcrowded and understaffed hotel. A couple of saddled horses were tied up there while their riders ate inside. Once he made sure no one was watching, he unlocked and opened the window, then removed the wire screen. A red fire exit lamp hung from the ceiling nearby, but he couldn't reach it, nor could he find a wall switch. By that time, he knew the window was Dick's only way out. He cleared the grating of a broken box and an empty flower pot, placed the screen outside the wall, and then, still unnoticed, went back to his room and packed his stuff. Dick was still asleep, stretched out on his bed, when he returned to room 320, but Bassett's careful plans soon started to unravel. Dick's body was twitching, his face pale and covered in cold sweat. Instead of figuring out how they could leave, Bassett started wondering if they would get away at all. Dick's sleep looked more like a stupor. Bassett sat by the bed, closer to sheer panic than ever before, racked with guilt and responsibility. As the afternoon dragged on, it became clear he needed a doctor. He weighed his options. Maybe a new doc, someone who didn't remember Judd Clark, could work. But he hesitated until at 7, Dick opened his eyes and didn't recognize him. Then he knew it was out of his hands. Fate, destiny, or whatever controlled human lives had taken over. He got his hat and left, heading downstairs again. Wilkins was gone, but Bill still stood at the entrance, watching the people coming and going. In his nervous state, Bassett felt the hotel clerk's eyes were suspicious as he extended their stay for another day, and Bill seemed to watch him with more interest than usual. Even cancelling the car order seemed risky, but he did it, and then went out to find a doctor. Luckily, fate was on his side. The first doctor's sign led him to a young man, new to town, and clearly not busy. He didn't find out immediately. First, he concocted a fake condition for himself, just like he had done before, got a prescription, paid for it, and learned what he needed to know. Then he brought up Dick. He made sure to highlight Dick's name, profession, and reputation back home. "I'll admit I'm pretty worried about him," he said. "He saw that I was registered and came to my room this morning, but he got sick while he was there. He complained of a really bad headache and feeling dizzy. I helped him to his room and got him onto the bed, and he's been asleep ever since. He looks pretty bad to me." He noticed Bill's gaze on him as they walked through the lobby, but those eyes didn't seem suspicious anymore. Bassett was sweating profusely. He stopped outside the room and wiped his face. "You look a bit rough yourself," the doctor observed. "Be careful with this, son. It's dry here, so you Eastern folks don't realize the heat until it really hits you." The doctor made a thorough examination of the sleeping man, while Bassett anxiously watched his face. "Does he drink, do you know?" "No, I don't think so. I gave him a small drink this morning because he seemed to need it." "Has he been like this all day?" "Since noon, yeah." The doctor leaned over once more. When he straightened up, his news hit Bassett hard. "I don't like his condition or that twitching. If it were the old days in Wyoming, I'd say he's on the brink of delirium tremens. But that's just a quick guess. He could be on the verge of several things. Either way, he should be moved to the hospital. This isn't the right place for him." Bassett had no argument against such practical advice. If the doctor had noticed, he would have seen Bassett's gesture of defeat. "I guess so," Bassett said flatly. "Is it close by? I'll go myself and get him a room." "That's my recommendation." I'll check in later. If he doesn't snap out of it, I'll call in a specialist, the doctor said, picking up his bag and looking down at the bed. He's a big, handsome guy, isn't he? Married? No. All right, we'll get the ambulance, and later we'll give him a full examination. I'd recommend getting a maid to sit with him in the meantime. Overwhelmed by the situation, Bassett pressed the bell. The door was answered by the elderly maid, who usually managed his own room. Reflecting on it months later, Bassett would wonder if it was mere chance or some fated design that brought the Thorwald woman to the door that night. At the time, he chalked it up to tragic luck, the same kind that had placed the warning letter in Dick's hands, drawing him west. But as time passed, the role of that faded woman with her tired voice and ash-grey hair took on larger, more ominous proportions. Sometimes he wished a premonition of danger had driven him to silence her right then, stopping her from raising her alarming voice. But he had no such foresight. All he saw was a woman in a worn-out blue calico dress and a fresh white apron, looking at him with indifferent eyes. "Is it okay if she stays in the hallway?" Bassett asked, still struggling with his sense of defeat. "She can go in if he moves." "Sure thing," said the doctor, who had picked up some British phrases during his time in France. Bassett walked back from the hospital alone. He knew it was over. Sooner or later the end would come. He tried to justify his actions to himself. He had done his best. A few days ago, he would have felt triumphant over these developments. After all, Clark was a murderer. Others who killed faced their punishments. And maybe, just maybe, the game wasn't entirely over yet. Luck had been on his side for a while, and it just might continue. The hospital was new, oddly enough named Clark Memorial Hospital. There was still hope. As he walked into the lobby, something felt off. The constable was gone, and there was no one at the front desk. A group of guests and loafers stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up, while a bellhop blocked the way. Bassett's first instinct was that there might be a fire. He pushed through to the stairs and demanded to go up, but was stopped. "Just a few minutes," the boy said. "No need to worry." "Is it a fire?" Bassett asked. "I don't know. I've got my orders, that's it." Wilkins hurried in. The crowd parted respectfully, allowing him to pass, and then closed ranks behind him. Bassett remained at the foot of the stairs, looking up. Chapter 26. She seemed to exist only from one visit of the mail carrier to the next. Sometimes she felt like only part of her was really at home in the Nola house, sleeping at night in her white bed, dressing in black, and making those somber daily trips to the cemetery above the town. There, her mother tenderly maintained the elongated grave that painfully reminded her of Jim's tall, slender figure. This part of her grieved deeply, finding solace in small, comforting gestures and gentle touches on bowed heads and sorrowful shoulders. She dutifully put away Jim's clothes and kept the room where her mother spent most of her waking hours spotless. Each night she knelt to pray for Jim's happiness in some heavenly place befitting a young man. But another part of her wasn't there at all. It was with Dick in some far-off, enigmatic place called Wyoming. Because of this split within herself, she felt that her loyalty to her family was faltering. She knew deep down that she had already left her parents in spirit and would follow her love, Dick, for the rest of her life, making her more determined to comfort and please them. "She's taking Dick's absence really hard," Mrs. Nola remarked one night after Nina went upstairs to bed, having kissed them good night. "I worry about her sometimes." Mr. Nola sighed. Why couldn't a man convey to his children the lessons he had learned, that nothing turned out as grand as expected, that love was worth living for but not dying for? The impatience of youth for life. It had killed Jim. It was hurting Nina. Everything would come in its own time. Young people didn't live for today but always dreamed of tomorrow. First, you look ahead and say, "I will be so happy." Then, before you know it, you're looking back and saying, "I was so happy." "She'll be all right," he said aloud. He stood up and called the dog. "I'm taking him for a walk before I lock up," he said wearily. He leaned down and kissed his wife. She looked so sad in her black dress. He never told her what he sometimes thought, that Jim was spared a lot. Living on and losing loved ones one by one was harder than leaving quickly from a joyful youth. He hadn't told her what he knew about Jim's friend that night because she wouldn't have understood. In her simple, childlike faith, she believed their son was in heaven with the blessed. He believed Jim had gone forgiven into whatever was beyond the curtain we call death, and that he faced the judge clean and absolved, one who understood the push and pull of youth and life. He didn't fear for Jim, he just missed him. He walked around the block that night, an ordinary figure, the dog by his side. Now and then he spoke to the dog for a bit of company. At the corner he stopped and looked down the side street toward the Livingstone house. He sighed as he looked. Jim, Nina, and now Elizabeth. Jim and Nina were out of his reach now. There was nothing more he could do. But what could he do for Elizabeth? Wasn't that beyond him too? He stood there, feeling the weight of his helplessness, filled with vague fears. Then he trudged on, hands clasped behind him, his head bowed. Late into the night he lay awake, wondering if he and Dick had been fair to Elizabeth. She should have been told. If Dick's fears were right, she needed to be prepared. What if something happened out there that would break her heart? He thought Margaret was asleep, but after a while she moved and slipped her hand into his. It comforted him. That too was life. They would soon be alone together again, just like in the early days before the kids came along. After all these years and struggles, they were back to where they started, but still, thank God, hand in hand. Ever since Jim's death, Mrs. Sayre had been a constant presence in the house. She brought a solid, practical air with her, and her demeanor, neither forcedly cheerful nor excessively mournful, made her very welcome. After the first few days, when she had practically moved in, there was no need for any pretense with her. She knew her way around the china closet, the pantry, and the kitchen. She even ventured into Mr. Nola's worn old den on the second floor, where she had slept part of that first night on the leather couch with broken springs that he kept because it fit his body perfectly. She was kind and full of pity. Usually detached from the town's affairs, she felt a small glow of contentment from being able to help. She liked the family, especially Elizabeth. Yet, after seeing Dick and Elizabeth together a few times, she realized that no plan she could make for Lassorda would work. Lying on that old leather couch during her first night, in between her frequent checks on the restless family, she'd thought it over and let it go. But in the days following the funeral, she became increasingly worried about Lassorda. Word of the engagement had reached him, making him restless and irritable. He preferred not to go out, instead wandering around the house or sitting alone on the terrace late into the night, gazing down at the town with sad, sunken eyes. A few times, he took his car out in the evening, and she would hear him returning late at night, lying awake in her French bed. In the mornings, his eyes were bloodshot, and his complexion poor, a clear sign that he was drinking to get to sleep. 3 days after Dick left for the West, she got up when she heard him come in, and putting on her robe and slippers, knocked on his door. "Come in," he called gruffly. She found him with his coat off, standing half defiantly with a glass of whiskey and soda in his hand. She walked over and took it from him. "We've had enough of that in the family, Wally," she said. "It's a pretty poor way to deal with problems." "I'll take that back, if you don't mind." "Nonsense," she replied briskly, and flung the glass out of the window. She turned to him with an air of authority. "I've been a pretty lenient mother," she said. "I've left you alone because Sayres tend to bolt when they feel restrained. But my patience has limits, and it's reached when my son drinks to forget a girl." He flushed and scowled at her in brooding silence, but she moved around the room calmly, giving it a critical inspection, seemingly unaware of his anger. "I don't think you ever loved anyone in your life," he said harshly. "If you had, you'd understand." She was straightening a picture over the mantel, and finished her task before turning to him. "I care about you." "That's different." "Fine, I cared for your father. I cared a lot, and he killed my love." She walked out of the room, her heavy-set body in the bright kimono moving stiffly, but her face calm and composed. He continued staring at the door after she had closed it. He understood the message hidden in her emotionless words, a warning as well as empathy. She had cared deeply, and his father had ruined that love. He had drunk and partied through his young life, and then died, and no one had truly grieved for him. She had left the decanter on its stand, and he moved toward it. With a half-smile, he picked it up and walked to the window. Still smiling boyishly, he turned off the light and slipped into bed. It dawned on him that the milkman's early morning drive would encounter quite a bit of broken glass. After a restless night, he resolved to give up drinking and figure out where he stood with Elizabeth. But for a couple of days, no opportunity arose. Whenever he visited, there was always some mournful, grave-faced visitor around, draped in dark clothes and speaking in hushed tones, filling the room with the somber atmosphere of a house in mourning. This aura seemed to affect Elizabeth too, making her appear distant and otherworldly. He would arrive, bursting with impatience and longing just to see her, only to confront a new spirituality in her that made him feel ashamed of his own desires. One time he found Clare Tessler there, sensing something electric between them. After a while, he realized what it was. Behind Clare's soft voice and sympathetic words was a hidden hostility. She watched Elizabeth closely, over-aware of her, and curiously enough, she seemed to be cozying up to him. He thought he saw a fleeting look of relief on Elizabeth's face when Clare finally decided to leave. "I'm off to see the man Dick Livingstone left in his place," Clare said, adjusting her veil in the mirror. "I've got a cold. Isn't it odd how the whole Livingstone connection has just dissolved?" "Not really odd, and it's only temporary." "Maybe, but if you ask me, I don't think Dick is coming back. I'm not defending the town, but it hates being deceived, and he's been deceiving it for years. I know lots of folks who'd stop going to him." She turned to Wally. "He is David's nephew, you know. The question is, who is he?" "Of course, I don't say it, but a lot of people think when someone takes on a false identity, they have something to hide." She didn't wait for them to reply, and instead walked out with a deliberately sensual strut. Outside the door, her smile vanished, replaced by a look of hardness and bitterness. She might move on from Dick Livingstone, but she'd never forgive herself for admitting what she did to Elizabeth, nor Elizabeth for hearing it. Wally turned to Elizabeth after she left, looking slightly confused. "What's gotten into her?" he asked, and then, noticing Elizabeth's pale face, he added shrewdly, "That was a blow for him and two for you, right?" "Probably. I wonder if you'd look like that if anyone attacked me." "No one attacks you, Wally." "That's not an answer. You wouldn't, would you? It's different, isn't it?" "Yes, a little." He straightened up and stared past her at the wall, unseeing. "I guess I've known for a while," he finally admitted. "Didn't want to believe it, so I ignored it. Are you engaged to him?" "Yes, but it's not public yet, Wally." "He's a good guy," Wally said after a long pause. "Not that it makes this any easier," he added with a forced smile. Then he blurted out, "Oh, my God." He sat down, and when the dog came over and rested its head on his knee, he absent-mindedly patted it. He wanted to leave, but felt that once he did, it would be for good. "I've loved you for years," he said. "I haven't been much, but I'd have been a lot worse if it weren't for you." And again. "Just last night, I decided that if you'd have me, I'd turn my life around. I guess it's pretty weak to put that kind of responsibility on a girl." She felt compassion for him and tried to offer small gestures of friendship and affection, but he barely seemed to notice, lost in the selfish sorrow of his disappointment. When she heard the mailman outside, she went to the door to collect the mail, thinking he hadn't noticed. But when she came back, he was watching her with jealous, almost sorrowful eyes. "I guess you hear from him, with every mail delivery." "Nothing today." Something in her tone or expression made him scrutinize her more closely. "Has he written at all?" "The first day he arrived, not since then." He left soon after, not entirely convinced he was leaving for good. In his skeptical young mind, fueled by Clare's spite, a comforting doubt about Dick's sincerity was starting to grow. Chapter 27. Bassett sank into a chair, feeling sick and shaky. Something had happened, possibly a room-by-room search for Clark, and they'd found him. He couldn't think straight or plan anything. If Dick were okay, they might have tried to make a run for it. The fire escape was ready. But as things were, the murmurs from the crowd at the foot of the stairs died down, and Bassett looked up. Wilkins stood on the staircase, scanning the lobby. When he spotted Bassett, he rushed down, anger and suspicion on his face. "You're involved in this, aren't you?" he snapped. "You might as well tell the truth. We'll catch him. He can't leave town." With those words, and the realization that Dick had somehow escaped, Bassett's mind cleared. "What's your problem, Wilkins?" he demanded. "Who escaped? I couldn't get that mute bellhop to tell me anything. Thought there was a fire." "Cut the act, Bassett. You've had Judd Clark hidden in room 320 all day." Bassett stood up and loomed angrily over the sheriff. The crowd turned to watch. "In room 320, he said. "You're nuts, Judd Clark. Let me tell you something. I don't know what's going through your head, but room 320 is occupied by a Doctor Livingstone from near my hometown. Well known and highly respected. What's more, he's sick, and if he's escaped, as you say, he's probably delirious. I had a doctor check him out an hour ago. I just arranged for a hospital room for him. Does that sound like I'm hiding him?" Bassett's confident identification and indignation shifted Wilkins' attitude. "I'll need you to stay here until I get back," Wilkins said, his tone more official than accusatory. "We'll have him within half an hour. It's definitely Clark. I'm not saying you knew it was Clark, but I need to ask you some questions." He stepped out, and Bassett heard him barking orders in the street. He moved to the door and saw a search in progress, conducted by both the police and local volunteers. Men on horseback rode by to secure the town's borders, and searchers nearby were combing through yards and alleyways. Bassett felt powerless. He stood there, watching as his plan unraveled, feeling the curious eyes of a few hotel loungers, and expecting any moment to hear of Dick's capture. It seemed inevitable to him. He had no idea how Dick had been identified or how he had managed to escape. Attempts to get information from the room clerk by rekindling their former friendly relationship were met with suspicion and a cold shoulder. Resigned, he returned to his chair against the wall and waited for the end. An hour later, the sheriff returned, looking grim. "I'll see you now," he said curtly, and led Bassett to the office behind the hotel desk. Bassett's last bit of hope faded when he saw the elderly maid, looking pale but steady, seated there. The sheriff got straight to the point. "Here's what we know about your involvement, Bassett," he said. "You hired a car to take you both to the main line tonight. You paid off Clark's room and your own this afternoon. When you found out he was sick, you cancelled the trip. Is that correct?" "It is. I've told you. I knew him from home, but not as Clark." "I'll let that pass for now. You planned to take the midnight train on the main line, but you ordered a car instead of using the branch road." "Livingstone was sick. I thought it would be easier, that's all." His voice grew sharper. "You can't drag me into this, Sheriff. First of all, I don't think it was Clark. He wouldn't come here of all places. I didn't even know he was here until he walked into my room this morning." "Why did he come to your room?" "He saw I was registered. He said he felt sick. I took him back and put him to bed. Tonight I called a doctor." The sheriff reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. Bassett felt his spirits sink when he saw it was Gregory's letter to David. "I need you to explain this. It was on Clark's bed." Bassett took it and read it slowly, deep in thought. "I see," he said. "Well, that explains why he came here. He was too sick to talk when I saw him. This letter isn't addressed to him, but to his uncle, David Livingstone. David Livingstone is the brother of Adam Livingstone, who died a few years ago at Dry River. This is related to a personal matter involving the Livingstone estate." The sheriff took the letter and read it again, still puzzled. "You're quite the smooth talker," he admitted reluctantly. He turned to the maid. "All right, Hattie," he said. "Let's hear that story again, but hang on a second." He turned to the reporter. "Mrs. Thorwald here hasn't seen Lizzie Lazarus, the squaw. Lizzie has been in my office since noon. Now, Hattie." Hattie licked her dry lips. "It was Judd Clark for sure," she said. "I've known him on and off all my life. But I wish I hadn't screamed. I don't think he killed Lucas, and I never will. I hope he gets away." She glared at the sheriff, but he just smiled grimly. "What did I tell you?" he said to Bassett. "That's Judd Clark, all right, and we'll catch him, Hattie. Don't worry, keep going. She looked at Bassett. When you left me, I waited outside the door like you said. Then I heard him moving, so I went in. The room was dim, and I didn't recognize him at first. He sat up in bed, looked at me and said, "Why, hello, Hattie Thorwald. That's my name. I married a Swede." Then he took another look and added, "Sorry, I thought you were Mrs. Thorwald, but now I see you're older." I realized who he was then, and I felt like I might faint. I knew he'd be arrested the moment it was known he was here. I said, "Lie down, Mr. Judd. You're not well." Then I closed and locked the door. I was terrified. Her voice quivered as she searched for a handkerchief. The sheriff glanced at Bassett. "What's your version of the Livingstone story?" he asked. "Okay, Hattie, let's hear it." I said, "For God's sake, Mr. Judd, lie still until I figure out what to do. The sheriff might be downstairs right now." Then he went frantic. He jumped off the bed, listening and staring, shaking all over. "I've got to get away," he said loudly. "I won't let them take me. I'll kill myself first." When I touched his arm, he threw it off and headed for the door. I saw he was delirious with fever. I stood in front of the door and begged him not to go out, but he shoved me so hard that I fell and screamed. And then what? That's all. If I hadn't been almost out of my mind, I would have never admitted it was Judd Clark. That guilt will haunt me forever. An hour or so later, Bassett returned to his room mentally and physically drained. He knew from then on he would be under suspicion, probably watched closely, so he methodically locked his door and went through his papers. He burned his notebook and clippings about the Clark case in the wash basin, then carefully cleaned it. Having completed his duties attending to a sick man, and with the letter found on the bed as the only concrete evidence linking him to the situation, he considered sneaking out via the fire escape to look for Dick himself. However, his unfamiliarity with the area rendered that option impractical. At midnight, he sprawled on his bed without undressing, methodically reviewing everything. He didn't know much about the different mental conditions that affect memory, but had a vague sense that lost memories tend to come back eventually. Dick, recognizing the chambermaid, suggested that this might be happening. He wondered what it would be like for someone in that position, trying to think in their shoes. It was too much to grasp. Frustrated, he gave up and stared at the ceiling, contemplating his role in the disaster. In his mind, he saw himself, driven by training and instinct, leading the charge toward this night's tragic events, planning, scheming, searching. Now, as everything spiraled outside of his control, he lay helplessly on his bed. When a car backfired on the street below, fear jolted through him. He resolved then and there to dedicate the next few months of his life to fighting the mess he had helped create. Yet, even with this new determination, he saw how futile it all was. He might fight tirelessly, but nothing could restore Dick Livingstone's reputation. He might be saved from his past, but his future remained irrevocably damaged. Suddenly, he noticed someone quietly picking the lock of the door to the adjoining room. He slipped cautiously off the bed, went to the light switch, and stood there silently, hand poised to turn it on, and waited. The wild idea that it might be Livingstone was at the forefront of his mind. When the door creaked open and closed again, that was the name he whispered into the darkness. "No," came a woman's voice in a whisper. "It's the maid, Hattie. Be careful. There's a guard at the top of the stairs." He heard her moving towards his outer door, knowing she stood there, listening, her head pressed against the panel. Once she was satisfied, she swiftly moved to the stand beside his bed and turned on the lamp. In the soft light, he saw she wore a dark cape with the hood pulled over her head. In a strange way, the maid and even the woman seemed to disappear. She stood there, mysterious and dramatic. "If you found Judd Clark, what would you do with him?" she asked. The eyes beneath the hood searched his face. "Turn him over to Wilkins and his crew." "You know better than that." "Do you have any plan?" "Plan? No. They've got every way out blocked, don't they? Do you know where he is?" "I know where he isn't, or they'd have caught him by now. And I know Judd Clark. He'd head for the mountains just like he did before. He has a good horse." "A horse?" "Listen, I haven't told anyone this, and I don't plan to. They'll figure it out in a couple of hours anyway. He got out through a back fire escape, they know that. But they don't know he took Ede Ricketts' black mare. They think he's on foot. I've been down there now, and she's gone. Ede's up on the top floor playing poker. They won't finish until around 3, and he'll notice his horse is missing then. That's 2 hours from now. Bassett tried to see her face under the shadow of the hood. He was both puzzled and suspicious of her sudden change in attitude, more than half convinced it was a trap. "How do I know you're not in cahoots with Wilkins?" he demanded. "You could have diffused the situation tonight by just saying you weren't sure." "I was upset. I've had time to think it over." Eventually, he had no choice but to trust her, although he couldn't shake the feeling that she had some ulterior motive, something stronger than mere compassion driving her. "Got a plan for me, then? I can't just chase after him into the mountains at night and expect to find him." Yes, he was delirious when he left. That stuff about the sheriff being after him, it wasn't true then. Not until I raised the alarm. He's still delirious and thinks it's the same night. Wouldn't he try the same thing again and head for the mountains and the cabin? He went to the cabin before. Bassett glanced at his watch. It was 12:30. "Even if I could get a horse, I couldn't get out of town." "You might on foot. They'll be tracking Ricketts' horse by dawn, and if you can get out of town, I can get you a horse. I think I can help you get out, too. I know every inch of the place." Bassett's main feeling during the tense moments that followed was a sense of surrealism. The cloaked figure of the woman in front of him, their passage through 2 dark and empty rooms using a pass key to a rear corridor, and the descent down the fire escape. All of it felt like something out of a play. They pressed against the wall as a man, possibly one of the posse, rode up, tied his horse, and stamped noisily into the building. The woman's sure movements and silent footsteps kept his nerves on edge, amplifying the surreal quality of it all. At the bottom of the fire escape, she disappeared silently, but under Bassett's feet, a tin can rolled and clattered. A horse snorted right by his shoulder, freezing him with fear. After that, she took his hand and led him through an empty outbuilding, across another yard, and into a street. At 2 in the morning, Bassett was waiting on a lonely road near what he assumed was the camp of a drilling crew. He heard a horse approaching, snorting nervously. He stepped back into the shadows until he recognized the familiar silhouette leading it. "It's my son's horse," she said. "I'll sort it out with him tomorrow. But if you get caught, you have to say you took it on your own, or we'll all be in trouble." She gave him detailed instructions on how to find the trail and urged him to hurry. "If you manage to get him," she advised, "don't stop. Keep going over the range." He paused with one foot in the stirrup. "You seem pretty sure he's headed to the mountains." "It's your only chance. They'll catch him anywhere else." He mounted the horse and got ready to ride off. He would have shaken her hand, but the horse was still spooked by her shrouded figure, snorting and veering away when she got close. "No matter what happens," he said, "you've done your best, and I'm grateful." The horse moved forward, leaving her standing there with her cowl pulled forward and her hands crossed over her chest. She faced the mountains for a moment, looking oddly like a monk. Then she turned back toward the town. Chapter 28. David's world was built on the sands of forgetfulness. David himself was gone, as were Lucy and Elizabeth, who wasn't even a part of his consciousness. The war, his work, his new role in society, all of it had been wiped out, drowned in the flood of memories brought back by Bassett's shocking revelations. The breaking point didn't make itself known right away. There was confusion first, then stupor and unconsciousness, and from that, clear and sharp, came memory. It wasn't 10 years ago, but just an hour, even a minute ago, that he had been staring at Howard Lucas lying on the floor of the billiard room, and he had seen Beverly burst through the door. "Bev," he was saying, "Bev, don't look like that." He moved and found himself in bed. It had been a dream. He took a deep breath, looked around the room, saw the woman, and greeted her. But he already knew he hadn't been dreaming. Things were becoming sharper in his mind. He shuddered and looked at the floor, but no one lay there. Only the horror in his mind and the intense need to escape from it. He wasn't thinking at all, just driven by the need to flee and the sensation of being chased. They were after him. They would catch him. They must never catch him alive. Instinct and will replaced thought, and whatever part of his brain that had opened up was clearly impacting his physical condition. He showed all the signs of prolonged heavy drinking, his nerves were shot, and he twitched and shook. When he went down the fire escape, his legs could barely support him. Finding Ede Ricketts' horse in the courtyard, saddled and ready, matched the brain pattern of his past. Like walking into a room he'd never entered, but somehow found familiar. For a moment he felt like he'd done this before. Just for a moment. Memory faded, and he mounted his horse, heading for the mountains and the cabin. By some odd quirk of habit, despite it being from just one intense experience years ago, he followed the same path he had taken a decade earlier. How precise his route was, no one could tell. Did he pause at certain turns to look back, or let his horse catch its breath, as he might have before? Probably not, for as he left town and rode up the canyon trail, it felt like he was fleeing from demons. One thing was clear. The familiar path must have reinforced his sense of the past. Again, he was Judson Clark, a man on the run from himself after committing murder. Soon, his horse was clearly in distress, but he didn't notice. At the end of a long climb, the horse stopped, but he drove it on mercilessly. He was oblivious to his own exhaustion, even as he began to sway in the saddle. When they finally reached a meadow, the horse stumbled, throwing him off. He lay there for a while, not injured but seemingly without the will to move. He drifted between moments of clarity and a drunken haze. But eventually, the urge to flee resurfaced, and he remounted and set off. Sleep overtook him in the saddle. When the horse stopped, he would rouse and kick it on. Once, he woke to the sound of roaring water, realizing his horse was struggling through a river, nearly submerged. He managed to turn it upstream and get clear. As dawn approached, some of the confusion lifted, but he remained stuck in the past. The horse meandered along with its head down, occasionally pausing to nibble on a leaf or take a long drink from a spring. Dick was avoiding thoughts, as if something inside him wouldn't let him think clearly. He felt weak and emotional. He murmured, "Poor Bev, poor old Bev." A flood of tenderness and memories overwhelmed him. Poor Bev. He had really made her life miserable. An almost uncontrollable urge to turn the horse around and see her once more welled up inside him. He was a goner anyway. They'd catch him. He wanted her to know that he would have rather died than do what he had done. The urge to flee faded. He felt sick and cold, and now and then he shivered violently. He started watching the trail behind him for any sign of pursuit, but without fear. It felt like he'd been wandering for thousands of endless dark nights, through deep ravines and over peaks that reached the stars, and now he just wanted to rest, to stop somewhere warm and sleep. Let them come and take him, anything to get out of this nightmare. As dawn was still barely breaking, he heard a horse coming from behind and below him on the trail along the cliff face. He stopped and waited, turning around in his saddle, his expression a mix of defiance and helplessness, like a boy in trouble and cornered. The rider appeared on the trail below, riding hard, a middle-aged man in a dark suit and a straw hat, an odd sight and clearly tired. He leaned forward as he rode, occasionally lifting his eyes from the path to scan the cliff above with bloodshot, anxious eyes. At the bend below, the man saw Dick for the first time and spoke in a calm voice. "Hey there, old man," he said. "I was starting to think I'd miss you after all." His careful look at Dick's face seemed to reassure him. The delirium had apparently passed. Although he was a mess, covered in dust and sweat from the ride, Livingstone's eyes were steady. But as Bassett rode up, he wasn't so sure. Livingstone seemed to look at him with a kind of cold hostility that caught him off guard. "Miss me," Livingstone sneered bitterly. "With your squad covering every damn hill by now, if I'd had a gun, you wouldn't have caught me alive." Bassett was confused and a bit annoyed. "My squad? Listen, kid, I've risked my neck half the night to pull you out of this mess." "Not even God could get me out of this mess," Dick said somberly. It was then that Bassett noticed something off in his expression and moved in closer. "Look, Livingstone," he said gently, "no one's coming for you. I'm here to make sure of that. We've got a good head start, but we need to keep moving." Dick sat stubbornly, his horse blocking the trail, his eyes still wary and unfriendly. "I don't know you," he said bluntly. And I'm done running. Go back and tell Wilkins I'm here and he can come get me. The sooner the better." The sneer faded, replaced by a deep, haunting dread that shook the reporter. "My God," he said, "I killed a man last night. I can't live with that. I'm done." Last night. A hint of realization dawned on Bassett, a suspicion of the truth. But there was no time to dig deeper. He glanced back along the trail to see if the pursuit was catching up. When he was sure they were still safe, he spoke again. "Get a grip, Livingstone," he said firmly. "Think clearly. You didn't kill anyone last night. Now listen closely," he added with emphasis. "You are Livingstone, Dr. Richard Livingstone. You stick to that and think about it." But Dick wasn't listening. Instead, he suddenly turned his horse around on the trail. "Move," he said. "I'm going back to turn myself in." He would have done it, probably, pushing past Bassett on the narrow trail and heading toward capture if not for his horse. It balked and spun on the ledge, refusing to pass Bassett. Dick cursed and kicked the horse, his face set with determination, but it stubbornly resisted. He slid out of the saddle and tried to drag the horse forward, but he was suddenly weak and nauseous. He staggered. Bassett dismounted in an instant and caught him. He eased him onto a boulder, and Dick sat there, his shoulders slumped, his body trembling. "I've been drinking non-stop," he finally said. "If I had a drink now, I'd pull it together." He tried to sit up. "That's part of it. Sure, I'm panicking, but that's not all. I'd give anything for some whiskey." "I can get you a drink if you come on about a mile," Bassett coaxed. "There's a cabin we talked about yesterday." "Now you're talking." Dick summoned some strength and got to his feet, shaking off Bassett's arm. "Just keep your hands off me," he said irritably. "I've got a hangover, that's all." He got back into his saddle without help and started up the trail. Bassett took another look across the valley, but it was empty except for a deer drinking at the stream far below. He turned and followed. He was feeling pretty hopeless by then, given Dick's unexpected resistance and the drastic change in him. He was dealing with something he didn't understand, and the idea of delirium didn't make sense. There was a desperate clarity in Dick's eyes. That statement about drinking non-stop. Yesterday he hadn't seemed like a heavy drinker, but now he did. He was twitching, his hands shaking. Sweat beaded on his face as he lay on the rock. Hadn't the doctor mentioned delirium tremens yesterday? If he collapsed now, it was all over. Capture was inevitable. He didn't need to lead Dick to the cabin. Dick turned off the path on his own. Bassett, following behind, watched him dismount and examine the ruin with a perplexed expression. But Dick stayed silent. When Bassett finished tying up the horses and came inside, he found Dick sitting on one of the broken-down chairs, staring blankly. "Get me that drink, will you? I'm falling apart." Bassett found his tin cup on a shelf and poured out a small amount of whiskey from his flask. "This is all we've got," he warned. "We need to go easy with it." The effect was almost instant. The twitching subsided, and a bit of color returned to Dick's face. He stood up and stretched. "That's better," he said. "I was done in. Felt like I'd been on that damn horse for years." While Bassett lit a fire and set the coffee pot to boil, Dick wandered around. Glancing up, Bassett noticed Dick examining the ruined linter from the doorway with an unreadable expression. But Dick didn't say anything until Bassett called him over for some food. Even then, he remained terse, as if he was listening and waiting for something. At one point, a noise startled the horses outside, and he sat up, alert. "They're here," he said. "I don't think so," Bassett replied, heading to the doorway. "No," he called back. "You go ahead and finish. I'll keep watch." "Come back and eat," Dick said, irritated. He ate very little but drank some of the coffee. Bassett also ate sparingly, mentally preparing for the struggle ahead, organizing his arguments for their escape, and trying to gauge the changes in the man across the table. Dick set down his tin cup and got up. He felt strong again. The chaotic nightmare of the previous night had faded away. In its place, a sharp clarity and a courage born from desperation surfaced. He remembered everything clearly. He'd killed Howard Lucas the night before. It wouldn't be long before Wilkins or one of his men showed up to take him back to Norada. He wasn't scared of that. They'd always think he fled out of fear of getting caught, but that wasn't it. He'd run away from Bev's face. except he couldn't really escape it. She'd been on his mind all night and still was, but he had to go back. He couldn't get caught like a rat in a trap. The clerks didn't run away, they were fighters. Only the clerks didn't kill, they fought, but they didn't murder. He grabbed his hat and headed to the door. "You've been really kind, old man," he said, "but I've got to go back. I ran last night like a scared kid, but I'm done with that foolishness." "I'd really like to know what made you run last night," Bassett said, watching him closely. "You were safe where you were." "I don't know what you're talking about," Dick said wearily. "I didn't run from them. I ran to get away from something." He turned away, irritated. "You wouldn't understand. Say I was drunk. I was, for that matter. I'm not over it yet." Bassett observed him. "I see," he said softly. "It was last night that this happened. You know it, don't you? And after it happened, do you remember what followed?" "I've been riding all night. I didn't care what happened. I knew I'd run into a massive blizzard, but He stopped and stared outside, to where the horses grazed in the upland meadow, knee-deep in mountain flowers. Bassett, watching him, saw the disbelief in his eyes and spoke very gently. "My dear fellow," he said, "you're right. Please try to understand me and stay calm. You did ride into a blizzard, that's true. But that wasn't just last night. It was 10 years ago." Chapter 29. Struggled through the tense hour that followed. If he thought just stating the facts and showing proof would bring results, he was wrong. The urgency of the situation and the fear of being chased made him jittery and unclear. First, he had to accept the unthinkable himself. Dick Livingstone no longer existed. He had vanished into some hidden part of his mind. He did everything to bring him back to awareness, but it didn't work. His task was even harder because he knew so little about Dick's life. The name David meant nothing to him, and it was the only name he had. He described the Livingstone house and Elizabeth as he had seen her at the theatre that night, even Minnie. But Dick just shook his head. Until he could ignite some instinct or will to live, he couldn't counter Dick's resolve to go back and surrender. "I understand what you're saying," Dick would say. "I'm trying to get it, but it doesn't mean anything to me." He even brought up the war. "War? What war?" Dick asked, and groaned when he heard about it. "A war," he said, "and I've missed it." But soon after that, he stood up and moved to the door. "I'm going back," he said. "Why?" "They're after me, aren't they?" "You're forgetting again. Why would they be after you now, after 10 years? "I see. I can't get it, you know. I keep listening for them." Bassett was listening too, but he kept his worries to himself. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally. "I was drunk, and I hated him. He married a girl I was crazy about." Bassett tried a different approach. He pointed out how absurd it was to surrender for a crime committed 10 years ago and forgotten by now. "They won't convict you anyway," he urged. "It was just a fight, wasn't it? I mean, you didn't shoot him on purpose." "I don't remember. We quarreled. Yes." "I don't remember shooting him." "What do you remember?" Dick struggled, his face pale. "I saw him on the floor," he said slowly, then staggered a bit. "So, you don't even know for sure if you did it?" "I hated him." Bassett noticed that Dick's resolve to turn himself in was weakening. He pressed on, using every argument he could think of, and finally brought up what he hoped would be the clincher. "Listen, Clark, it's not just about making a place in the world, as I've told you. You've built relationships you can't just walk away from. Think about the Livingstones. You told me yesterday that a shock might kill the old man, and there's more to it than that. There's a girl back in your town. Weren't you engaged to her?" But if Bassett thought that would break through to Dick, he was wrong. Dick's face turned red, and he walked over to the cabin door, just as he had gone to the window the previous day. He didn't look back when he spoke. "Then I'm a real jerk," he said. "I've only ever loved one woman in my life, and now I've ruined her forever." "You mean?" "You know who I mean." Later, Bassett mounted his horse and rode out to a ledge overlooking a long stretch of trail in the valley below. Far away, he saw horsemen, little darts moving steadily along. He turned and headed back to the cabin. "We need to move," he said. "It's up to you where we go. You have two options. You can go back to Norada and risk getting arrested. You know what that means. Without much chance of a conviction, you'll still face trial and cause misery for those who care about you. Or you can come with me over the mountains and find a railway to the west. At least you'll have time to think things over. They've waited 10 years. They can wait a bit longer." Dick agreed with a sense of detachment that surprised Bassett. He seemed unusually passive, barely caring about the urgency with which Bassett cleaned up their meal, put out the dying fire, and scattered the ashes. Even when they mounted and deliberately avoided the trail, Dick gave directions to the railroad at the western foot of the range only when asked, and later found a trail for them a few miles from their starting point. Mostly, though, he just followed in silence. Their progress was painfully slow. Both horses were exhausted and hungry, and the terrain was rough and hazardous. Without Dick's knowledge of the area, they'd have been hopelessly lost. Despite his own aching muscles, Bassett's spirits lifted as they made their way forward without encountering any pursuers. By mid-afternoon, they had to rest the horses and let them graze, and their own need for food became urgent. Dick lay down and immediately fell asleep, but the reporter couldn't relax. The enormity of their task weighed on him. They'd covered around 20 miles since leaving the cabin, but still had 60 more to the railroad. With fresh horses, they could have made it by dawn, but he doubted their tired mounts could go much farther. The land ahead seemed to get worse, not better. The pass they needed to cross was snow-filled. Bassett also worried about Dick's condition. The twitching had stopped, but he looked pale and slept like a man completely spent. They needed to cross the pass by nightfall, or they'd have to wait till dawn. Around 5 p.m., Bassett scouted the trail and then woke Dick to get moving again. Near the pass, Dick stirred and took the lead. "Let me go first, Bassett," he said firmly, "and let your horse have its head. He'll take care of you if you give him a chance." Bassett was relieved to step back. He was exhausted and tense. The trail terrified him. It clung to the side of a rocky wall, twisting and turning. It ran under milky waterfalls of glacial water, and higher up it crossed an icy field that was a slick bridge over a rushing stream below. To make matters worse, mosquitoes swarmed around them in relentless clouds, and tiny black gnats got into their eyes and noses, driving the horses crazy. After they crossed the ice field, Dick's horse slipped and couldn't get up. It lay there, struggling futilely, its sides heaving, eyes rolling in distress. They gave up and prepared to set up camp as best they could. With the sunset, it turned bitterly cold, and Bassett had to start a fire. He did this sheltered by the mountain wall, while Dick, having unsaddled his fallen horse, built a rough windbreak out of rocks. Eventually, the exhausted horse managed to stand, but there was no forage, and the two animals stood despondent, occasionally pawing at the moss and scrub pines in a hopeless search for food. Before turning in, Bassett divided the last of the flask between them, along with his remaining cigarettes. Dick didn't speak. He sat with his back to the shelter, staring at the fire, lost in what Bassett knew were troubled and conflicting thoughts. Once, as the reporter was drifting off, Dick spoke. "You said I told you about a girl," he said. "Did I tell you her name?" "No." "All right, go to sleep. I thought hearing it might help." Bassett watched him. "Better get some sleep, man," he said. He dozed off, only to wake up again, cold and shivering. The fire had burned low, and Dick was still sitting there, lost in deep thought. He looked up, and Bassett was struck by the quiet sorrow on his face. "Where's Beverly Carlisle now, do you know?" "Yeah, I saw her recently." "Is she married?" "No, she's brought back the valley, and is performing in New York." Dick only slept for an hour that night. In his dream, he felt at peace, happy, with a girl in a black dress who embodied that peace. When he woke, the warmth of the dream lingered, but he couldn't recall her. She had faded into the night's shadows. Sitting by the fire in deep despair, he realized he had lost 10 of his best years. He couldn't return to what he left behind. Only shame and regret awaited him. He glanced at Bassett, sleeping by the fire, trying to understand his presence. Who was he and why had he come? Why had he ventured alone into the unknown mountains to find him? As if sensing Dick's intense gaze, Bassett stirred, opened his eyes groggily at first, then fully awake. He propped himself up on his elbow, listening intently as though expecting a distant sound, his face tense with worry. But the night remained silent, and he relaxed, drifting back to sleep. Suddenly, a realization solidified in Dick's mind. He rose, walked to the edge of the mountain wall, and listened. When he returned to the fire, he rummaged through his pockets, found a small pad and pencil, and began writing by the firelight. At dawn, Bassett woke up feeling stiff and miserable. He grunted and looked around the small plateau. It was empty, save for his horse, endlessly searching for grass. Chapter 30. David was thoroughly enjoying his post-breakfast cigar, surrounded by newspapers and magazines. He had made friends with the waiter who brought him breakfast and the young chambermaid who tidied his room. Their conversations often went like this. "So, Nellie," he'd say, "did you go to the dance on the pier last night?" "Oh, yes, Doctor." "Did your boyfriend show up?" "Yes, he did. He couldn't call because he was working out of town." At this point, David might lower his voice, since Lucy was never far away. "Did you wear the flowers?" "Yes, violets. I saved one to remember you by. It was funny at first. I wouldn't tell him who gave them to me." David would chuckle with delight. "That's the spirit," he'd say. "Keep him guessing. Us men are tricky creatures, Nellie, tricky." Even the valet warmed up to him, asking if the doctor needed someone at home to help with his clothes. David found this immensely amusing. "Well," he said with a gleam in his eye, "let me tell you how I manage now. When I need my trousers pressed, I send them down and wait in my bathrobe. I'm a bit better off with boots, but you'd have to knock out Mike, my handyman, before he'd let you touch them." The valet grinned. "And then there's my nephew," David continued, a hint of pride in his voice. "He's recently engaged and has bought some new clothes, but I doubt even he would want someone to hold his trousers while he steps into them." David found this so amusing that he laughed about it long after the valet had left. He was perfectly content. He spent every afternoon in a roller chair, chatting casually with the man who pushed him, and whenever Lucy was out of sight, he'd occasionally get out and stretch his legs. He picked up lost kids and stray dogs, tried his luck at a shooting gallery, and struggled to stay off the roller coasters and out of the ocean. One day, after he'd been away for a while, he was shocked to find Harrison Miller sitting in the hotel lobby. David lit up with surprise and joy. "You old fraud," he said. "Off on an adventure after all, and you thought it was so absurd when they sent me here." Harrison Miller looked uneasy. He had planned to see Lucy first. She was practical and would know how much David could handle. But David didn't notice his discomfort. He took him up to his room, made him appreciate the ocean view, handed him a cigar, and then sat down across from him, all smiles and hospitality. "Good grief, Miller," he said. "I didn't realize I was homesick until I saw you. So how's everything going? Dick's letters have been short, and we haven't heard from him in days." Harrison Miller cleared his throat. He knew David hadn't been told about Jim Nola's death, but that Lucy knew. He also knew from Walter Nola that David didn't know Dick had gone west. Did Lucy know that or not? Probably yes. But he thought the whole plan was absurd and a mistake. It was making him uncomfortable, and he usually prioritized comfort. He decided to stall. "Things are pretty much the same," he said. "They're going to pave Kisham Street, and your Mike knocked down the night watchman last week. I got him off with just a fine. I hope he hasn't been in my cellar. He has his weak moments, but how's Dick? Not overworking, I hope." "No, he's fine." But David wasn't easily fooled. He started to notice something off in Harrison's manner and leaned forward in his chair. "Look here, Harrison," he said. "There's something bothering you. You've got something on your mind." "Well, yes and no. I'd like to see Lucy, David, if she's around." "Lucy's out and about." "Can you tell me what's going on? Is it about Dick?" "In a way, yes." He's not sick, is he? No, he's fine as far as I know. I think it's best I just tell you, David. Walter Nola's got some kind of obsession, and he persuaded me to come here. Dick was really exhausted, and a few things had him worried. One of those things was that Jim Nola, you'll find out sooner or later, got into a car accident, and it killed him. David's face lost some of its color. It took him a moment to speak again. Poor Jim, he said hoarsely. He was a good guy, just full of energy. This is going to be tough on the family. Yeah, Harrison Miller replied quietly, but David also felt a wave of resentment. When his friends were in trouble, he wanted to be in the loop. He was slightly indignant and a bit hurt, but quickly shifted his focus back to Dick. I'll head back and make sure he takes a break, he said. I'm as good as I'll ever be, and the kid needs rest. What's Nola so worked up about? Look, David, you know your business best, and Nola didn't give me many details. But he seemed to think you're the only one who can tell us certain things. He'd have come himself, but it's hard for him to leave his family right now. Dick left town right after Jim's funeral. He put a young guy named Reynolds in charge, and I think to avoid worrying you, arranged for some letters to be sent at intervals. Where did he go? David asked, his voice filled with dread. To a place called Norada in Wyoming, somewhere near his old home, and the Nolas haven't heard anything from him since the day he arrived. That was 3 weeks ago. He wrote Elizabeth the night he got there and sent her a wire at the same time. David clutched the arms of his chair, struggling to stay composed. I'll head to Norada immediately, he said. Harrison, get a schedule and summon the valet. No way, you're not going anywhere. That's my job once I have something concrete. Nola hoped you'd heard from him. If not, I was to gather all the information and then head out. Elizabeth's near frantic. We wired the Norada police chief yesterday. Of course, David said, his voice thick with frustration. Leave it to your friends to screw everything up. Now you've got everyone on his trail. He slumped back in his chair, gasping, open the window. When Lucy entered 30 minutes later, she found David on the bed, the hotel doctor beside him, and Harrison Miller in the room. David was struggling to breathe, but conscious and unusually calm. He looked at Lucy and spoke slowly and clearly. They've got Dick, Lucy. He appeared aged, defeated, devoid of hope. Even after his heart had settled and he lay quietly among the pillows, there was no sign of his former fighting spirit. He stayed with his eyes closed, relaxed, and unresisting. He had tried his best and failed. It was now out of his control, resting in God's hands. At one point he prayed, admitting his failure, acknowledging his age and frailty, and asking God to take over and do his best. Yet he added that if God didn't save Dick and bring him back to joy, then he, David, was done. Before dawn, he awoke from a light sleep. The door to Lucy's room was open, and a soft light glowed from within. David called out to her, and her quick response made it clear she hadn't been sleeping. Yes, David, she answered, entering in her bedroom slippers and a rumpled robe, looking worried but forcing a smile. What do you need? Sit down, Lucy. Once she did, he reached out for her hand. This touch of affection after so long both moved and alarmed her. David was silent for a while, lost in thought, before he spoke again. I'm not in great shape, Lucy. You probably know that. This old heart of mine is giving out. I don't want you to worry if something happens. I've got a lot of folks waiting for me over there, and going will be like coming home. Lucy nodded, her chin trembling. She gently smoothed his veined hand. I know, David, she replied. Mother and Father Adam and many friends, but I still need you. You're all I have now that Dick is gone. That's why I called you. If I can make it, I will. And I'll fight so hard they'll regret ever starting anything. But if I can't, he squeezed her hand tighter. If Hattie Thorwald is still around, we'll need her to testify. If I can't go for any reason, I want you to make sure she's called. And you know where Adam's statement is, right? In your box, isn't it? Yes, start by reading the statement, then call her to confirm it. I'll tell you the story I've shared with you, or no, I'll dictate it to you tomorrow and sign it in front of witnesses. Jake and Bill will testify too. With the plan set, David felt more at ease. He had organized his strategy and started his preparations for the fight ahead. He now felt less worried about drifting off to sleep and waking up among the loved ones he had lost long ago. After a few moments his eyes closed, and Lucy went back to her bed and crawled into it. That morning it was Harrison Miller who took the statement. Lucy's cramped, old hand wrote too slowly for David's impatience. Harrison wrote out the statement on hotel stationery, neatly filling the pages with his precise handwriting. His face remained impassive, but his interest was intense, for by then he already knew Dick's story. In his normally orderly bachelor life, filled with daily newspapers, gardening, and nights spent reading political economy, he had never been so close to the raw emotions of love and hate, and the chaos they brought with them.